Day I signed the papers on my cabin in northern Wisconsin, I sat in the parking lot of the township office and just stared at the steering wheel for a long time. 34 years. That's how long I spent as a structural engineer, showing up to job sites before sunrise, driving home after dark, missing Little League games and school plays because some developer needed a load-bearing calculation by Monday morning. 34 years of that, and what I had to show for it, besides a bad left knee and a drawer full of retirement statements, was this: 83 acres on the edge of Turtle Lake, a 2-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch, and nobody in the world who could tell me what to do with it. My wife, Carol, passed 6 years before I retired. Pancreatic cancer. We'd talked about that cabin for years. How we'd spend our mornings fishing off the dock. How she'd paint the landscapes she never had time for. How we'd finally slow down. She never got to see it. But I bought it anyway because I needed something to retire toward and because some part of me thought she'd be up there somehow, in the quiet of the water and the tree line. I have one daughter, Meredith. She was 31 when I bought the cabin. Smart woman, quick-tempered like her mother, good heart underneath it. She'd married a man named Troy 2 years earlier. I want to be fair about Troy. When they first got together, I thought he was decent enough. A little too comfortable spending money he hadn't made yet. A little too quick with opinions he hadn't earned, but I'd seen worse. I told myself it was none of my business. Meredith was an adult. She knew her own mind. I was wrong to wait that long to look closer. The cabin needed work when I bought it. Previous owner had let the back deck rot. The generator was held together mostly by optimism, and the dock had 3 boards that would send you straight into the lake if you stepped wrong. I didn't mind any of it. I spent the first 2 summers making it right with my own hands. Replaced the deck boards myself, rewired the generator shed with a friend who'd been an electrician before he retired. Rebuilt the dock on a Saturday in June when the water was so still it looked painted. I wasn't fast. I was thorough. There's a difference. By the time I turned 62, the cabin was exactly what I wanted it to be. I knew every corner of it. I'd earned every inch. Troy called me on a Thursday in October. Meredith was at a curriculum planning meeting. She teaches 4th grade at an elementary school about 40 minutes from where they live, so it was just him on the line, which I noticed. He didn't lead up to it. That part I'll give him. He didn't dress it in fake concern or small talk. He just said that his parents were in a tough spot, that they'd been renting in Florida for years and the landlord had sold the building, and they needed somewhere to land while they got back on their feet. He said the cabin was sitting empty most of the year anyway. He said it made sense. I want you to understand how he said it. Not asking, not hoping, like he was describing a plan that had already been decided and he was filling me in as a courtesy. I asked him a few questions. What kind of timeline were his parents thinking? He said a year, maybe 2. Were they aware he was calling me, or was this his idea? He said they were all on the same page. Had he mentioned this to Meredith? He said she was on board. I said I'd think about it and let him know. I hung up and called Meredith. She answered on the second ring, which told me the meeting was either over or she'd stepped out. I asked her how she felt about what Troy had just proposed. There was a pause that was one beat too long. She said she thought it could work, that his parents were in a hard situation, that it was just temporary. She said it like she was reading from a card. I've known Meredith her whole life. She wasn't telling me what she thought. She was telling me what she'd agreed to say. I told her I'd call her back. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was angry, though I was, but because I was thinking. I'm an engineer. When something looks unstable, my first instinct isn't to push back against it. It's to understand where the failure point is. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold, and I thought about Troy for a long time. He'd quit 2 jobs in 3 years. The reasons always made sense on the surface. The commute, a bad manager, a better opportunity that never quite materialized. Meredith had been covering more of the bills than she let on. I'd picked that up in small ways. Things she mentioned and then walked back. And now he was making a decision about my property without asking me, and somehow he'd gotten Meredith to sign off on it before he called. That's when I started paying closer attention. I hired a home security company out of Rhinelander. 3 cameras, 1 on the front porch, 1 covering the back door and the dock. one inside above the fireplace aimed at the main room. I paid for the professional installation. I set up remote monitoring on my phone and my laptop. It took an afternoon. I also called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt, who I'd worked with during the estate settlement after Carol died. I told her the situation. She said what I already knew. I had no legal obligation to house anyone. She also said something I hadn't thought about. She said if someone established residency at the property, even without my permission, it could complicate removal. She told me to document everything. I thanked her and asked her to stay available. 3 weeks later, Troy called again. His parents had accepted. They'd be driving up from Sarasota the first week of November. They just needed to know where the spare key was. I said there was no spare key. I said I hadn't agreed to anything. He got quiet in a way that was different from surprised. It was the quiet of someone recalculating. He said he thought I was on board. I said I hadn't said I was on board. I'd said I'd think about it and let him know, and I was letting him know now. The cabin was not available. Not for 1 year, not for 2, not for a season. I didn't want anyone living there without me, and I didn't want his parents moving in under the premise that it had already been decided. He said I was being selfish. He said his parents had nowhere to go. He said family was supposed to help each other. I said that was true, and that's why I'd helped Meredith through college and helped them both with the down payment on their house 3 years ago, which I'd never once mentioned until that moment. I said there's a difference between helping family and being told what to do with your own property. He hung up before I finished the sentence. Meredith called me 20 minutes later, upset. I listened. I didn't argue. I told her I loved her, that this had nothing to do with her, and that I needed her to trust me on something without being able to explain it fully yet. She went quiet, in that way she has when she's not happy but she's listening. I told her to give me a little time. That was the first week of November. The second week of November, I drove up to the cabin to do a winterization check. It's about a 3-hour drive from my house, rural highway most of the way, cell reception that goes in and out around mile marker 40. I got there on a Friday afternoon and saw a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. Florida plates. I sat in my truck at the edge of the gravel for a moment. Then I pulled up my phone and checked the camera app. The front porch camera showed a woman in her 60s setting a potted plant next to my front door. The back camera showed a man about the same age, stacking firewood I had split myself. The interior camera showed 2 suitcases open on my living room floor, a jacket draped over the back of the chair I'd refinished 2 summers ago, and a coffee maker on my kitchen counter that was not mine. Troy had let them in. I had no idea how. I would find out later, from Meredith, when everything came out, that he'd had a locksmith make a copy of her house key, which I'd once given her for emergencies. I hadn't known she'd given him a copy of mine. I sat in that truck for probably 4 minutes, then I got out. I walked up to the front porch and introduced myself. His father's name was Glenn. His mother was Patsy. They were perfectly pleasant. They shook my hand and said Troy had taken care of everything. Said what a beautiful property it was. Said they couldn't thank me enough. I told them Troy had not taken care of everything, and that I had not given permission for anyone to stay at this cabin. The pleasantness drained out of the conversation pretty fast after that. Glenn said there must have been a miscommunication. I said there wasn't. I had a clear recollection of telling Troy no, and I had the phone records to confirm the date and time. I said I understood they'd driven a long way and that what Troy had done to them was not fair, but they couldn't stay. I gave them until the following morning. I told them I'd be in touch with Troy directly. I went inside, sat down in my own chair, and called Patricia. That night, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I opened my laptop and pulled up the full history on the camera system going back 4 days. Glenn and Patsy had arrived on Tuesday. That gave them 3 days in my cabin before I showed up. But I also found something else in that footage. The day before they arrived, Troy had come to the cabin alone. He spent 2 hours inside. I watched him walk through every room. He opened closets. He looked through the desk in the corner where I keep property tax records and the original deed paperwork. He photographed things with his phone. I could see the screen lighting up as he moved around. He stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at nothing in particular. I called Patricia again that night. She told me to get the footage off the camera system and onto a USB drive immediately, which I did. She said the behavior was consistent with someone trying to understand the financial value of a property. She asked if I'd had any conversations with Troy or Meredith about what would happen to the cabin after I was gone. I hadn't, but apparently Troy had been having those conversations with Meredith. Here's what Meredith told me later in pieces after it all came apart. Troy had been telling her for over a year that I was getting older, that the cabin was too much for one person to manage, that it made sense to start thinking about transition. He used that word, transition. He told her that his parents could be caretakers, live on site, keep the property maintained. He told her that eventually the cabin would be hers anyway, so why not start building toward that now? He was speaking about my death as a financial planning milestone. He'd convinced Meredith slowly and carefully that this was responsible thinking. What he hadn't told Meredith was that he'd opened a joint investment account using her information, her social security number, her bank account linked without her full understanding, and had been moving money out of her teacher's pension contributions in small amounts for 9 months, not large enough to trigger automatic alerts, large enough to add up. I didn't know about that yet. When I drove home from the cabin that Saturday, I knew about the locksmith copy. I knew about the footage. I knew about the photographs of my documents. That was enough to have Patricia file an unauthorized entry report with the county sheriff, which we did the following week. What broke the rest of it open was an accountant. Meredith had always had a financial advisor who'd helped her set up her retirement accounts when she started teaching, a careful older woman named Sandra Oakes who sent quarterly summaries. Meredith usually glanced at them and filed them away. After everything started coming out about the cabin, I asked Meredith gently whether she'd looked at her most recent statement closely. She hadn't. We sat at my kitchen table together one afternoon in December and opened it. The discrepancy wasn't hidden once you were looking for it. 9 months of small transfers routed through the joint account Troy had set up, totaling just under $31,000. Meredith sat very still for a long time. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She was the one who called the attorney. What followed was not fast and it was not clean. Divorce in Wisconsin is a process. There were hearings. There were delays. Troy got his own attorney and spent 2 months arguing that the joint account transfers were agreed upon household financial decisions, which required Meredith to go back through her email and text records to demonstrate that she'd never been told the account existed. It was exhausting. It was humiliating in the way that being deceived always is, not because of what it says about you, but because of all the moments you replay and ask yourself how you missed it. The sheriff's office investigated the unauthorized entry separately. Troy's attorney tried to argue that the key was given in good faith for legitimate property access. Patricia countered with the camera footage, specifically the solo visit where Troy had photographed the deed and tax records. The DA's office declined to prosecute on felony grounds. The argument was that the connection to criminal intent wasn't clear enough without a completed fraud, but the civil findings were a different matter. The court ordered restitution on the financial account, full amount plus interest. Glenn and Patsy had left the cabin by 9 o'clock the morning after I arrived. I don't know where they went. I genuinely felt bad for them, in the way you feel bad for people who trusted the wrong person, even when that person was their own son. The cabin sits the same as it always did. I was up there in April, just after the ice went out on the lake. I fixed a section of gutter that hadn't made it through the winter and sat on the dock for a while watching a pair of mergansers work their way along the far shore. The water was still too cold for most things, but the light had that late afternoon quality it only gets in spring, where it comes in low and turns everything amber. Meredith came up in May with her dog, a half-shepherd mutt she'd adopted the previous fall. We didn't talk about Troy much. We talked about her classroom and about whether the cabin could handle a small wood stove addition on the screen porch, which I told her I'd look into. We had dinner on the wraparound porch and watched the sun go down over the water, which takes a long time up there in summer. The sky holds the light longer than you expect. She asked me at some point during that weekend whether I'd had a sense something was wrong before everything came out. I told her the truth. I said I hadn't had a sense of something wrong so much as a sense of something off, that there's a difference. Wrong is a conclusion. Off is just a signal that more information is needed. I'd spent 34 years learning that when something in a structure looks off, the right response isn't to ignore it and it isn't to panic. It's to look more carefully. It's to document what you find. It's to build something solid enough that it doesn't need you to defend it. It can speak for itself. The cameras did that. The paper trail did that. 34 years of working carefully did that. Meredith scratched her dog behind the ears and looked out at the water for a while. Then she said, "I'm glad you kept the cabin, Dad." I told her I was too. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. And the thing that stays with me isn't the anger. I'm past that. It's how ordinary the warning signs were. Troy never showed up one day as a villain. He showed up as his son-in-law who was a little too comfortable, a little too certain, and I kept telling myself that wasn't my business. That gap between what I noticed and what I acted on is something I've thought about more than I'd like to admit. What I know now is that decency isn't passive. It doesn't just mean not doing harm. It means doing the harder thing when you see something wrong, even when it disrupts a peace you've worked hard to build. I didn't want conflict with Troy. I didn't want Meredith caught in the middle, but the longer I looked away, the more room I gave him to move. Troy counted on that. He counted on everyone in his life being reasonable enough, conflict-averse enough, to leave the space he needed to operate. What he didn't count on was someone who'd spent 34 years learning that the most dangerous thing you can do with a structural problem is pretend it isn't there. I think about the $31,000 Meredith lost. That money came from years of her showing up to a classroom every morning before most people were awake, teaching other people's children how to read. She earned that money in one of the most honest ways a person can earn anything. And it was gone because she trusted someone and because I didn't look closely enough soon enough. That's not guilt talking. It's just the math of how these things work. The people who act without integrity tend to succeed for exactly as long as the people around them stay patient and trusting, and slow to suspect the worst. What stopped it wasn't luck. The cameras, the phone records, the attorney on standby, the paper trail, none of that happened by accident. It happened because when I finally decided to pay attention, I paid full attention. I didn't half-measure it. I didn't hope it would resolve on its own. I did the work of understanding exactly what I was dealing with, and I did it quietly, without tipping my hand, without letting frustration push me into a confrontation I wasn't ready for. That kind of patience is harder than it sounds when someone is standing in your living room next to your furniture with their coffee maker on your counter. Meredith is doing well now. She's careful in ways she wasn't before, which I don't think is a bad thing. She knows her own accounts. She reads her statements. She asks questions. Some lessons cost too much, but they're still lessons. The cabin is still mine. I'll be up there in a few weeks. There's a section of screen porch I've been thinking about. A small wood stove, nothing complicated. I'll do most of it myself. That's always been the point. Not just to own the place, but to understand every part of it, to have earned the right to sit on that dock and watch the water without explaining myself to anyone. What I want people to take from this, if anything, is that your life's work is worth defending. Not dramatically, not angrily, but methodically. With evidence, with good people in your corner. With enough self-respect to say no clearly when no is the right answer. And with the willingness, when something feels off, to stop looking away and start looking closer.